Today on Triumph Talks, we are speaking again with Bailey Smith to dive a little deeper into the origins of narcissists as she has recorded in her book, Married to an Illusion, A Survivor's Guide to Identifying and Escaping Narcissistic Abuse. Bailey, thank you for coming back on the show and helping us to understand better all that you've learned from going through your own narcissistic nightmare, as it's sometimes called. So, let's begin by at the beginning. Where does narcissism come from?
Well, the theories are that we are not born that way. We are raised. And it usually stems from severe childhood abuse or neglect. There are different theories about all of this stuff. And, the child was neglected, abused, traumatized at a very young age, when they're, especially the most important times when their brains are beginning to develop the important abilities such as love and empathy, because this early abuse or neglect is the child learns that they're, especially if it's coming from their primary caregiver, and they can't trust them to provide for their needs. So they become traumatized, believing not only that their needs won't be met, but that they don't matter, and that the world is a scary and unsafe place. And that's just a tidbit of where it all begins, so.
Yeah. So out of that, they develop something in your book is defined as object lack of object constancy. I'm trying to get this. There we go. Sorry. So, which is when they are a child is neglected, abused, and traumatized at such a young age, and the brain is developing that they can't maintain a trust in something. And so the object constancy is very fluid. This is where they love you, they hate you. They love you, they hate you. If you do something good, they think that you're perfect. You're what the fantasy they've been looking for. If you do something wrong, then you're immediately something that they hate. And so that's object constancy. Healthy people have the ability to focus and not see somebody swinging so far in one direction or the other. And that's part of what we see as an early trait in narcissists. It seems to be that it's stemming from that and coming from the abuse. So when it comes to abuse, there's probably two different types. I know in your book you talk about the role of the scapegoat in the family and how that plays a role in developing the brain or the lack of healthy brain development. Do you want to expound on that a little bit?
So, sometimes in large families, or, that doesn't have to even be large families, but when the parents are unhealthy, there's always going to be somebody in the household that's going to be the scapegoat, the one that they're going to let out their anger, their frustrations, bad day, when they come home. And, lots of times it's the middle child, it's the oldest child. So it again, when a child is at a young age and their brain is starting to develop, every little bit of anything that's negative or inconsistent is going to affect them as they grow older, and have a huge impact. So, I would say, in a healthy home, you know, we always laugh about the middle child. I was a middle child, you know, being the rebellious one. But there's the norm, and then there's not norm.
Yeah. But I'd say that the concept of scapegoat is there's the norm that's healthy, right?
Right.
And then
Exactly.
there's the norm that is often a cause of unhealthy family
Right.
relationships, right? You see
Exactly.
certain traits or tendencies in a toxic home, and having a scapegoat child that gets the blame
Blame.
is actually a common action of an unhealthy parent.
Exactly.
So being that scapegoat child, a lot of times that is a connection to the formation of narcissism. And I think it's important as we talk about this to say that the origins of narcissism are they are laid out, but it's not a hard science, because there's so many factors, and where one child might be abused growing up and become a very compassionate, empathetic servant of others, where another child will be abused and become a narcissist. So it's not like this, well, if you were an abused child, you may be a narcissist, but we are showing the origins that can cause narcissism.
Right.
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 And so along with being abused as a child, they become they lose their self-esteem, but they also form a sort of second personality, and this is where the narcissism really takes place. That's a superior being
Right.
that is there to protect this weak little child. And
Right.
I know that when they become adults and you start dealing with the dangerous and hurtful ways that narcissism portrays in people and in our society, you're often dealing with someone who is dual. They're weak and afraid because of their childhood or because of how they were raised. And they also are very superior to everyone else because that's how they protect that
Right.
weak little
And I
child.
think that's where they get the name narcissistic personality disorder, because
Mhm.
it's a personality disorder. When somebody has more than one personality, and like you said, one can be protecting the other, um,
Mhm.
you know, that's, you know, this happens with any child that has had some sort of traumatic um, childhood. Not necessarily will they become a narcissist, but they'll have those multiple personalities.
Yeah. And there's a lot of different, I know there's um bipolar and there's borderline, and so there's multiple types of disorders that can come from um abuse. But narcissism is definitely one of them that stems from abuse. The abuse can happen on two sides of the spectrum. So we talked about the scapegoat,
Right.
but they could also potentially be the other end of the spectrum, which
Right.
is the child that never got the blame, that was
Right.
always treated as the superior one, never
Right.
had rules or boundaries. You want to talk a little bit about the golden child
So,
abuse?
you know, a golden child can have no rules or boundaries. They can also have parents that just don't care that they exist. So there's different, you know, ways of how this comes about. Um, you know, children depend on us as parents to be consistent, to be nurturing, to be loving, to be caring, and to show them the way. And, you know, when they don't have rules and boundaries, um, then they you're giving them a free pass to do whatever they want. These are also children that can be raising themselves.
Mhm.
So, you
Yeah.
know, yeah, I mean, when you take on the role of being a parent, you it's the most difficult job in the world, because you are responsible for you play the biggest role of how they can turn out. Now you can put every ounce of energy into your child, and then still have something happen. But in a normal, healthy situation, we are doing everything. Normal, healthy parents are doing everything they can. Being consistent is so important. Setting boundaries, rules, and as hard as it can be, especially if one parent is not healthy, it is the most important thing in the world, because you, like I said, play the biggest role of how they can turn out. So, trauma is if it's not dealt with, undealt with childhood trauma will have an effect on these children as they grow older. And in my book, I do talk about that later on. And then again, setting those boundaries and not having your children be able to do whatever they want. Rules and boundaries are in any aspect in life, whether it's in the workforce, I mean, whether it's in friendships, but most important when you're raising your children, you're not going to keep allowing your child to touch a hot stove, because they're going to burn themselves and get hurt. I mean, you're going to protect them.
So
And
it's really it is a kind of child abuse, even though people may not look at it, which is
right,
to not provide them with the training and the instructions they need to be healthy. It's just abuse, sort of swinging in the opposite direction from those that where you're being negative or overly controlling.
right,
So I think that's good to point out that, and that's where the origins of narcissism. We have some good ideas. We can see the patterns, um, and even I think it's important for us to point out that, and I know that you point out in the beginning of your book, you're not a therapist, you're not a trained psychologist, but there is a science, a study of narcissism that that's going on, and it's so necessary. But at the end of the day, the people who've had to live with a narcissist are going to be every bit as educated, if not more so, than someone who's just studying
exactly.
that type. And so
And
that's really important.
I say that
Yeah.
all the time. I mean, I lived with a narcissist. He was raised by a narcissist. So I've seen it from the beginning. Well, not from the beginning, but I've seen where he came from. And I had to raise those children. Um, and I wanted them to be everything that I wanted to be the kind of parent that was the opposite, that was going to give them everything, but also not have, not have that guilt where I didn't set those boundaries. And I'm not going to say it was always very easy, but
Well, you've chosen to stop the cycle, and now
yes,
you're helping
trying
others.
very hard.
Yeah.
It's a lifelong, no matter how
Mhm.
old they are,
Yeah.
it's we're all constantly working on it.
Yeah, that's so important. So while we're talking about the origin of narcissism, we're saying, okay, they could be raised by being either treated this way or that way, on far ends of the spectrum of how you treat. There is a postulation that it also has a genetic component. And there's reason to see some who just do seem to come into the world despite coming out of a happy, loving, healthy family. You do see narcissists come out of that. So there's definitely a theory that there could be a genetic component to some narcissists as well. And you talk about that in your book. Um,
Yeah, I mean, um, I had mentioned in this exact chapter how my abuser's sister had done her thesis for social work
Mhm.
on narcissism, and going back 25, 20 something years, um, nobody knew about any of this
Mm.
information. And
Yeah.
when she handed in her paper, her thesis, um, um, you know, her professor was mind boggled. He's like, where did you get this information? And she said, I lived with it. So, and she was referring most likely to her mother. So there you go. You know, that's right there. You know, they also say that, you know, a mother that that may be doing drugs while she's pregnant can cause not only narcissism, but and all different kind of mental or physical health issues, because you know, typically we are not born bad. You know, it's our environment, it's how we're raised. You know, and trauma doesn't necessarily have to come in from the home. It can happen in school, sexual abuse, and you know, we have to teach our children it's okay. This is why it's so important. Education is so important. Teaching our children from a very young age what's okay and what's not okay. You know,
That's such a good point. I'm glad that you brought that up, because a lot of the conversation has been related to childhood, is what's happening in the home. But it's true. It could be from many different influences as someone is growing up and learning who they are and who they aren't, and trying to figure that out. And if they don't have good role models in many different areas of their life, it could potentially lead to the kind of trauma that creates that weak child who needs to be protected by the godlike persona that they take on. And so that's actually going to be the topic of our next show, which we've got coming up. Watch for the next one. We're going to be discussing the different types of narcissism and how to recognize them. And then we'll be doing a show that lets you know what are the signs, even the official from the official handbook of psychology. What are the signs of narcissism, so that you'll be able to protect yourself? So thank you for joining us, Bailey, and look forward to learning more from you in the upcoming shows.
thank you, Melanie.